The big story at the side seems the US and China have agreed to calm the trade tensions. The White House has issued a statement saying President Donald Trump has agreed not to raise tariffs on Chinese goods from the current 10% to 25%. The announcement comes after US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. This was their first meeting since the trade war erupted between the nations this year. The meeting lasted for nearly 2.5 hours. Later, the President Trump and his Chinese counterpart sat down for dinner.
The relationship is very special, the relationship that I have with President Xi. And I think that is going to be a very primary reason why we'll probably ending up getting something that will be good for China and good for the United States.
特朗普总统各位美国的市长朋友们，我非常高兴能够在路易斯安第斯有这样的一个会议，这体现了我们的个人友谊。在我们上一次见面之后，有一段时间了。这段时间里这个世界上还是又发生了一些事情。
Now, Beijing had been hoping to persuade Trump to abandon his plans to hike tariffs in January. Earlier, Trump had threatened to go ahead with imposing tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods to 25% from 10%. So the big story at this hour is that there seems to be a thaw in US-China relations, especially when it comes to the trade war. Now it seems that the US and China have agreed to calm the trade tensions. The White House has issued a statement saying President Donald Trump has agreed not to raise tariffs on Chinese goods from the current 10% to 25%. Now remember that the US and China have been embroiled in a trade war. In fact, economists from all over the world expressed their concern when both the countries have not been able to come to a consensus. But they have just met some time back at Buenos Aires at the G20 Summit. And after talks, you can see those visuals on your screen. You can see that President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are speaking for the first time ever since the trade war started, and there seems to be some resolution and some conclusion to the heated trade war between these two countries. Now, the announcement comes after US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. Now, this was their first meeting since the trade war erupted between the nations this year. The meeting on your screens lasted for nearly 2.5 hours. Later, the President and his Chinese counterpart sat down for dinner as well. In fact, for a very long time, Beijing had been hoping to persuade Trump to abandon his plans to hike tariffs in January. And earlier, Trump had threatened to go ahead with imposing tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods to 25% from 10%. And joining us for more on this story is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, joining us live straight from Buenos Aires, where the G20 Summit took place. A very good morning to you, Siddhant. It looks like there is some easing of tension between the US and China when it comes to the trade war.
Well, very good news coming from Buenos Aires as the US and China agreed to suspend the trade tariffs which they were imposing on each other starting in 2019, and also they have agreed that they will start conversations with each other, conversation and dialogue on each other on various reform processes, including the fact that China is going to buy a lot of stuff from United States, including in the agriculture sector. These talks are set to continue for 90 days, and only if the talks fail that the tariff will come back on each other. So this is a big story coming from Buenos Aires. Those statement released by the White House just a short while ago, in which it was said that the United States has suspended the tariff which was to be imposed on Beijing. Well, during the conversation, the U.S. President also mentioned North Korea. It is in the release, and he has asked President Xi to help him to make sure that the Korean Peninsula is nuclear-free peninsula. So that is a big story coming from Buenos Aires, even as we speak. So clearly it shows that Washington and Beijing now coming to terms with the fact that it's going to impact the global economy. We saw how the Indian Prime Minister raised this issue, the issue of trade wars impacting developing countries, emerging countries like India and other emerging countries having collateral damage because the world number one and number two economy were fighting with each other. But now, after that 2.5 hour meet, it was a working dinner which took place in Buenos Aires between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the US President Donald Trump. This statement by the White House, this shows that the consensus which it seems was not possible in the G20 Summit is possible, and we finally saw the communique. Even though the communique did not mention protectionism, unlike the BRICS communique which mentioned protectionism, their focus, of course, was on the trade wars. And finally, the big good news coming that the White House has suspended the tariffs on China.
Right, Siddhant, thank you for joining us with all those details. That was our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. He has been tracking the G20 summit very closely, and some very good news is coming from the G20. It seems that after President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping met, there seems to be easing of tensions when it comes to the ongoing trade war. It looks like the US and China have agreed for a trade war ceasefire after they met at the G20 summit.